attention is the process that we use to pick out what's important about the world. So I study vision, and so our eyes are bombarded by tons of information that does make its way in the brain. But if I had to react to, be conscious of every little fiber in the rug here or every little light in this room, I'd never get anywhere. I'd never be able to do anything. I need a rapid process that lets me pick out what's important. And what's important to me at this moment might be different than what's important to me in a few minutes, depending on my goals, on my idea, learning, things like this. So I think attention is a really key part of how we make sense of the world and decide how to act.
I'm John Fox, Director of the Del Monte Institute for Neuroscience here at the University of Rochester. And I'd like to thank you for joining us for another episode of Neuroscience Perspectives. Please do like us, follow us, wherever you get your podcasts or listen to your videocasts. I am delighted to be joined by a once aspiring mathematician, now turned neuroscientist, Dr. Marlene Cohen, who is Professor of Neurobiology at the Neuroscience Institute at the University of Chicago. Marlene is recognized for her pioneering use of multielectrode array recordings to show that a specific pattern of brain activity is reduced when the brain prioritizes information, and that the same mechanism is used when we learn. Today, her research investigates how neural activity gives rise to behavior, particularly in the context of visual attention, something close to my own heart. And she's also moved into translational work, clinical work. Marlene is the recipient of the Troland Research Award, the McKnight Scholar Award, the Alfred Sloan Research Fellowship, amongst many others. Marlene, thanks for coming to join us today on Neuroscience Perspectives. Great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a lot of fun to be here, and thank you for doing this. It's so important to talk to people about the brain.
Absolutely, yeah. And we're going to come to attention because that's my first love as well. But let's talk about this change in career trajectories. I mean, you start out as a mathematician and somehow you end up as a neuroscientist. Talk to us about that transition and where that came from.
So I've always loved math. My dad's a mathematician, and I think I grew up knowing that math is a way of thinking about the world. It's a way of solving problems, but it's also a way of seeing how different things fit together. And I think being able to understand how different things fit together, even when you can't see all of them or touch them, that's really the job of a neuroscientist. And so I think I still get to do math. I just get to apply it to problems that I'm really excited about. But it kind of sounded like when I said that was a well thought out transition. And the truth is that when I was a college student, loving my math courses, I needed a job. And for some reason, Matt Wilson, who is a terrific neuroscientist, I somehow convinced him to hire me in his lab to help with some experiments, and I really fell in love with those questions.
So needs must. You needed to earn a crust, and you ended up in a neuroscience lab.
Exactly.
But why choose a neuroscience lab? Why not like a theoretical physics lab? Was there something that led you to that, or?
Yeah, I think as neuroscientists, we get to think about who we are, right? We get to understand from a biological perspective, but also a mathematical one, how it is that we understand the world we live in, how it is that we have thoughts and feelings and percepts, and how it is we make decisions about how to act on the world.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine questions that are more exciting or interesting than
Totally
those.
agree with you.
Yeah.
You said something there when you're talking about mathematics, this idea that there's a codified structure where for things that you can't see. That's an important point there, I think, right?
I think it really is. You know, the human brain is maybe the most complex thing in the universe, and we're never going to be able to record all of the neurons or measure every aspect of it all at once. And so I think what we need to be able to do is take little samples, get little snapshots of it, and then put it all together and understand how it works as a complex system.
Yeah.
That's actually a lot of the job of a physicist as well about the universe. I think we're doing the same thing, just a smaller, more contained universe.
This gets at something kind of, I think that folks, in the real world, call it the real world, might find a little bit difficult, right? Because sometimes we talk about this biological thing between our ears, cells, a wet mush, biology, and we talk about it in computational terms, and we use mathematics to try and explain it. Maybe speak a little bit about why people do that and whether you think that is a strict correspondence, that mathematics really can explain the neurobiology of thought processes?
I think mathematics will be able to explain the neurobiology of thought process. And I think we're at a time where we're making more progress on that than ever before. We're not there yet. But I think we have this complex system. It takes in information, it performs computations, and then the output is how we act on the world. That those computations, those are the thought processes. And I think that's the right way to think about it.
Right. We'll park maths for a moment, and let's go back to your beginnings in a neuroscience lab. So you end up in maths lab studying
spatial navigation, how our brains help us navigate the world.
Right.
Yeah.
And there you're recording from just one neuron, is that right?
Matt is actually, you said I'm a pioneer, but Matt and many others are the real pioneers there. And I think that was a really formative experience for me. So there, the goal was to record from, at that time, a few dozen neurons at a time and understand how a rat navigated through a maze. And that linking neurons to behavior is something that really has been the thing that's driven my entire career. I might be the person on earth who has the worst sense of direction, and so spatial navigation.
Put it out there.
All right, well, but spatial navigation maybe not something I relate to so much, which is maybe part of why I moved to vision and visual cognition. But I think those ideas of understanding behavior through the lens of groups of neurons are really important.
Right. Yeah. So you worked as a technician while you were in undergrad. Is that how it worked?
Yeah, as an undergrad research assistant.
And that was at MIT?
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you decide, okay, a neuroscience PhD is where I'm heading. Is that?
Yeah. So while I was there, I got really interested in the science. My first projects in Matt's lab, I went and bought a huge box of chocolate sprinkles from the local ice cream store.
Oh, tell us about that.
I carried it to the lab on my bike and used that to train my rats to run around a maze. But while I was there, I learned about the science and got really excited about it. Took neuroscience classes. I actually added a second major in brain and cognitive science.
Gotcha.
And then moved into
so you
neuroscience
started
as a grad student.
So then PhD, you go to
Bill Newsome's lab at Stanford University.
So you flip coasts.
I did, yes.
Yeah. Well, let me just where in the States are you from originally?
Actually, from the Bay Area.
From the Bay Area. So you're heading back home.
Yes,
Gotcha.
Taking
Very
a break
good.
from winter. Yes.
So you go to one of the most famous labs in the world at the time, and certainly still, Bill Newsome's lab, and tell us about that transition and what you started to study there.
Yeah. So Bill was a real pioneer in understanding again how neurons give rise to behavior, this time in the visual system. And I think his real contribution has been taking a whole system from sensory input to these complex thoughts and ideas and plans to decision making, and then to cognition and to action.
Right.
And so I was really excited about that arc that he was building at the time. But as you mentioned before, the state of the art at that time was to record from one neuron at a time. And my big innovation in Bill's lab was to take two electrodes and glue them together and record from two neurons.
Two whole
at
neurons.
A time.
Well,
yeah. They used to give you a PhD for that. Now it's of course easy to record from hundreds or sometimes even thousands of neurons at a time.
Yeah. But it was revolutionary, really. I mean, that was the state of the art, was to get onto one neuron and really interrogate it.
That's right. And the thing that some early work in Bill's lab had shown was that you could learn more from two neurons than one. And that sounds a little bit trivial, but not just because you got more data faster, although that's of course nice, but they did an experiment where on one electrode they recorded two neurons at a time and found that the way that the neurons interacted with each other was really informative for understanding cognition and behavior.
Right.
And so that was my project, was to record from two neurons at a time and understand how the way they interact with each other depended on the goals or the cognitive state. Yeah.
And looking at two neurons, understanding that actually you're looking at two out of thousands, hundreds of thousands of neurons interacting, but it gives you an insight.
Billions, right?
Billions,
Yes.
exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. what I meant in the context of this very specific
Yes.
behavior, let's say. Yeah. And now multi-area responses, right? So recording across a network and across a system gives you much deeper insight, but also comes with its own travails because of this sheer quantity of data.
Yeah, that's right. I think we're at a really exciting point in our field where the experimental methods have just exploded. We can record, as you said, from lots of neurons, lots of brain areas, complex behavior. We can monitor behavior in ways that we couldn't before.
Right.
This is wonderful. I think we need to understand the computations to make sense of all of those data.
And back comes the mathematics then, because you can't just describe simple behaviors in a single neuron or two. You now need to talk about the hundreds of thousands of neurons interacting to affect behavior. Yeah.
Yep.
Attention becomes an important piece. Tell us. I used to teach a course on attention. I would go in at the beginning and I'd say, everybody write down a definition of attention. There might be 30 or 40 students in there, and there'd be 30 or 40 different versions of things. And many of us then, of course, maybe the most oft-cited quotation is the William James one about attention. But tell us about your understanding of attention and why you're fascinated by it.
I'm fascinated by it for a few different reasons. I think attention is the process that we use to pick out what's important about the world. So I study vision, and so our eyes are bombarded by tons of information that does make its way in the brain. But if I had to react to, be conscious of every little fiber in the rug here or every little light in this room, I'd never get anywhere. I'd never be able to do anything. I need a rapid process that lets me pick out what's important. And what's important to me at this moment might be different than what's important to me in a few minutes, depending on my goals, on my idea, learning, things like this. So I think attention is a really key part of how we make sense of the world and decide how to act. From a neural coding point of view, it's also really interesting because it's this thing that changes behavior, even when the sensory input could be the same. And that's a lot of how I've studied it. So create situations where the visual stimulus, where the sensory input is the same, but the behavior is different because we changed attention. And now we can understand what is it that changes in the brain that allows that flexible behavior.
Right. So a constant input, but maybe you're attending to different features of the colors, the motion, or a different piece of the space, and how the neurons then behave or how they affect that change.
Yeah, exactly. And you might have different goals or ideas or different knowledge and memory from past learning.
Right. And it does, I don't want to get us off on a tangent particularly, but like this kind of attention as a window into consciousness and free will, if there is such a thing. Do you think about that from a philosophical perspective as well sometimes?
I do. I love philosophy too. I took a bunch of philosophy courses also and still read and think about it sometimes. I think the control signals that guide attention are things that we can measure and understand from a computational point of view. And I like to think that those are the same types of control signals that govern things that are harder to measure and understand.
Fantastic, yeah. So you do your PhD with Bill, you learn these new techniques, you really develop and introduce new techniques there, and then tell us the next step in your trajectory.
Yeah, so I had been recording from 2 neurons and, cobbled together that data set with a lot of blood and sweat and tears. And learned a lot of things that actually the way neurons interact with each other is very flexible depending on goals. I wanted to study that more. I wanted more neurons. I was inspired by new work at that time with these multielectrode arrays that had been mostly used outside the visual system at that time. And I also wanted to study attention for all the reasons we just talked about. And so I moved to John Mansell's lab to do a postdoc.
And stayed with the attention theme. So.
That's right. So as a grad student, I think you could call what I did attention, although that would be generous of you. It was sort of 2 different task goals or task setups, which is, I think, related.
Yeah. If you were to say something to surprise the audience about stuff that you've learned, would you have something like that where you say, here's an insight that caught me by surprise? Is there
Yes. Can I have 2?
You can have 2. You can have 10.
I think one thing that I learned, and this sounds really funny given that we've just been talking about math, but that two is so much better than one, so much more than one, but actually maybe not as much better than or not so much worse than a billion. And what I mean by that is when we can study two neurons or two brain areas, it turns out that we can get insights about this whole complex system. I think that tells us something really important about the system, that it's actually, we talk about it in terms of the dimensionality, it's pretty low dimensional. And so when we record from two neurons or two brain areas, they're kind of representatives of their whole population. It's a little bit like you can get insight.
It's kind of fractal.
Yeah, a little. Yeah, and I think it's a little bit how political pollsters get insight. They definitely don't talk to everyone in the country, but they can get a guess about how things are going by talking to a small number of people, because those people are representatives of what's going on. I think that offers a lot of hope that the system works that way, that we can take these little snapshots and really understand the bigger picture pretty well.
I think that'll be a great relief to a lot of graduate students out there, that they actually, you can take a small little window and gain insights into the whole, the gestalt.
That's right. I think as we get more of the big picture view, that's going to, what I just said is going to be kind of true and of course kind of not true. And so we're going to keep learning more and more. But I think sometimes these little windows are very, very helpful. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is that I came at this from a very basic science point of view, maybe even more abstract coming from math. But I really think we are at a time when what we've learned from these basic science ideas can really help the billions of people in this world who have disorders of the brain, in particular disorders of cognition. Because I think that what we learned studying attention, even in these very controlled contexts, actually is insight into the computations that might be changing in a lot of disorders. And that's something I've been really excited about recently.
Excellent. All right. So we'll get back to the clinical application part, which I love, because there's a great trajectory here. So now, so you do your postdoc and then head off into an independent career.
Yes.
Did that take you immediately to Chicago, or did you have a stop in between?
I went to the University of Pittsburgh first. I was there for 11 wonderful years. Yeah. That was a really good community for me. It is a broad and deep community there, very integrated with Carnegie Mellon University. I got to interact every day with people who think about the brain from very different perspectives, ranging from molecular biology to psychology to machine learning and computer science and a whole lot of other things as well. And that interdisciplinary aspect is something that has always been important to me and really was nurtured there.
Yeah. Outstanding intellectual environment that Pitt always has been in the neurosciences. Now, was it intimidating? You go to set up in the beginning, because a lot of youngsters, young graduate students will be listening, and they're thinking about an academic career. What were those first couple of years like?
I get asked this a lot, and the truth is, it's hard for me to remember because it was such a whirlwind. So I showed up for my first faculty position 5 months pregnant with my first child. So we moved to Pittsburgh, bought our first house, started a lab, started a family all at once. It was a total whirlwind, but that was great perspective, actually. Yeah. I think a lot of people get there and they're alone in this empty room, full of boxes, and they think, oh no, this is this big daunting task. I didn't have time to be overwhelmed. I just kind of did stuff. And I think about where I was then and where I am now, and it seems like a giant gulf. On the other hand, you just, like everything else, you do it one step at a time.
Yeah. And when you're young, you have all that energy too.
Not necessarily when you're pregnant. But I do.
So now I happen to know the number of people who have sat in that seat who are neuroscientists, that very seat, or an equivalent one, and who are also musicians. Now, you're a musician as well, right? Is that part of your work-life balance?
It is. I have been playing in music in one way or another since I was 6 years old. Wow. I play a lot of woodwinds. I love saxophones. I love music. I played it sort of seriously in more formal groups all the way through my postdoc, which was always a really important thing for me. The starting a lab and having a baby all at the same time was not the best thing for my music career, but it's always been a part of what I do. I still play. Now both my kids are really talented musicians.
Is there some talk of a band, a family band or something?
We always have a family band going on.
Nice,
yeah,
okay.
I now have my older son is a terrific percussionist. We have a drum set and xylophone, and my younger son plays piano and is kind of interested in getting into brass. So we're building the band in the house.
Wow. So that's one of the ways in which you relax, calm your mind, and is it part of your creative process too in science, or are they different things?
Yes, I think it really is. I think for me, my best scientific ideas have not come at times when I've sat at a desk and thought, I'd like to come up with a good idea now. They come when I'm doing something else that occupies my mind but also allows it to think differently. Music has always been that for me. Exercise, being outdoors is also
Isn't that an
like
interesting
that.
thing? It's a different brain state, right? Different activation systems.
That's right.
Some people will talk about getting in the flow or something like that. Is that a bit of it?
I think that's right. I think it's really important to let your mind do other things, and I think about it sometimes in terms of populations of activity, right? When we're concentrating on something, the neural activity lives in one space, and then we do something else, and it's very different. And I think that's probably where creativity comes from.
Yeah. I don't want to get into anything controversial, but I'm just there's a raging debate these days. I'm really for quite a number of years about this idea of work-life balance, and work belongs in a box over here. Maybe it's 35 or 40 hours a week, and life is a different thing. Do you see it that way, or is there something? When you were really cutting your teeth and trying to make it as an independent scientist, were you able to do that, parse it out into two different boxes, or was it a different kind of system?
I think that everyone needs to sometimes leave work aside and concentrate on something else. That's really important. I also think the balance is really important, but I don't think you need to be balanced every moment or even every day or every week.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's really fun to work really hard at something and do something hard and figure it out.
Yeah.
For me, that's exciting and energizing, not draining.
Yeah.
I also think, as we were talking about, that some of my best ideas come when I'm not doing science. And, I get asked a lot, actually, as somebody who has kids, did that hurt my science? But gosh, that's a thing where, I had some of my best ideas pushing a baby in a stroller, right? It forces you to get out of the traditional ways you do science, but sometimes my mind goes there. And so I think balance is really important, integrated over some amount of time. But I also think it's not only okay, but really fun to love what you do and to think about it whenever that feels right.
Yeah. So advice to a youngster coming up in the system today, from your insights. I mean, I think you've already given us a good sense of that. You dove into having a family right at the crux of a career point, and you managed it, and you've become, a major leader in the field. But what would you say to youngsters today? I mean, it is a changing landscape out there too.
It is. I think you get one life and you get to do it how you want. And I think it is tempting, especially we have so much information at our fingertips right now about the landscape, about the probability of success. And I think it's tempting to take yourself out of the game too early. I think we all have responsibilities in this world, and sometimes circumstances happen that you can't go after what you want anymore. But until that happens, I would just say go for it. And I think people look for role models, and that's great. My work-life balance is not exactly like any of the mentors that I had. I think it's great to look for role models in lots of places, and not to think that one person is going to be your best role model, and take the best pieces of lots of inspiration and build the life you want.
Very good. Yeah. Let's go back to the work now. So you've all your training and the beginnings of your independent career are what we would call basic neuroscience. And then you found your way into the clinical domain, into what we call translational work. Tell us about that transition, what drove that, and how it's playing out for you.
Yeah. I, like a lot of people who get into neuroscience, I think, was motivated in part by a desire to help people. There are billions of people on this earth who have disorders that affect their brain, and I wanted to be able to do something about it. When I was a graduate student...
So let me, so that was always in the back of your mind?
I think it was in one way or another. But it felt at the beginning of my career like I had to make a choice. So at the time, translational neuroscience, clinical neuroscience was almost exclusively the domain of molecular and cellular neurobiology. That is not where my background or my skills or talents or interests particularly lie. I was really fascinated with this idea of using tools from mathematics to understand the computations in the brain, of linking neurons to behavior. That's always been the thing that drove me. I was really inspired very early by the work of Krishna Shenoy, who was just starting his lab when I was a graduate student. He used systems and computational neuroscience tools to build neural prosthetics. And that is maybe the earliest, one of the earlier domains where those approaches were used in a clinical sense. I've been interested in cognition a little bit more. And so at the time, that didn't feel like an option. As I've watched the field, I feel like this revolution we've had in techniques, in data, in ways of thinking about the brain as a complex system, this is exactly the time where these approaches really might be an important bridge between the work in cellular and molecular neuroscience and the clinic.
Very good, yeah. Any specific disorders that are in your crosshairs?
In the past 4 years or so, I have been on a really steep part of the learning curve about Alzheimer's disease.
Gotcha,
Alzheimer's disease is obviously an enormous problem in this country and around the world. There has been a tremendous amount of research at the molecular end and in human cognition, and very little in between. And the big things holding that field back are the attempt to link molecules to behavior in terms of treatment, and that's hard to do. The other thing holding it back is a real need for early detection. And I think the visual cognitive fields in systems and computational neuroscience have a lot to offer here. So we've been collaborating with John Morrison at UC Davis, who's been studying how Alzheimer's disease spreads through the brain. And one of the things that his group noted, and other groups have as well, is that the visual system is affected very early. And while those do not cause changes that would cause anyone to go to the doctor, we realize that the nerdy visual psychophysics things that we've been studying for years, that our field has been studying for years, could be really useful for early diagnosis.
For setting up an early flare.
That's
somebody
right.
in their 50s, you're at high risk. We need to do something.
That's exactly
now.
right. And there's been so much progress on treatments, but they only work when the disease is caught early.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
That is one of those defining characteristics of Alzheimer's. By the time you're showing the really classic symptoms, a lot of brain pathology is built up. We need to get in there sooner. So this is crucial work, right? Getting neuromarkers, biomarkers.
Exactly. And so I think, no one goes to the doctor because their psychophysical threshold on one of my nerdy little tasks has elevated by 10%. But we know how to measure that really carefully. Yeah. It's non-invasive. We could screen everyone.
Quick and easy to do, yeah.
That's right. And I also hope, and this is a little bit further behind, but we know a lot about the neural computations that underlie those behaviors. So now we have a computation that could be a target for a new type of treatment as well.
Yeah. So you've good outcome measure, quantifiable, objective, and possibly these kinds of nerdy little I love how you put that, psychophysics tests could be on people's cell phones ultimately, or that the kind of thing that they do once every couple of weeks or once every month.
Yes, that is exactly what we have in mind. I have a student who's been really looking into the practical aspects of how we get these ideas onto people's phones. Exactly.
Outstanding.
Yes.
Yeah. Amazing. Where we're heading with all of this, it's really something. And possibly then, where do you see the role for AI in that?
Yeah, so I think another thing that would really aid diagnosis is that currently the way that Alzheimer's is diagnosed mostly is, in the behavioral realm, is you take a test, a cognitive test, and you get a score, and there's a threshold which
The
puts
MoCA.
you, that's right,
Yeah.
which identifies you as being at risk for mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease. If a really high-performing person took that test, their performance would have to plummet in order to get below that
It has
threshold.
very little sensitivity, really.
That's right. And so we hope, exactly as you said, if people are just doing these little tasks on their phone regularly, we could use AI to make individual models, not just of behavior in general, but of your individual behavior,
right.
and be very, very sensitive to changes in an individual
And that's a key
person.
component too, which is a longitudinal, something that's light and easy, that doesn't involve going to a doctor's office or need a big insurance, payment, that you can track, at a relatively fine temporal scale over time, and look for those big discontinuities in them.
Exactly. And I think you said something really important about not needing to go to a doctor's office. That's obviously a financial thing, but there are many other disorders of the brain that really make people not want to go to the doctor's office. Things like depression and other mental health. Those are the people that we really might want to reach on their phones to not make them take those steps. Yeah. And so I really hope that these approaches can expand far beyond our initial focus.
I love it. I think you're absolutely right. I think we're really on the threshold of some major developments in this space. Can we backtrack in history to the youngster that was Marlene Cohen? Yes. What were you like as a young girl? Tell us about your family. You mentioned your dad's a mathematician, so the academy runs deep here. Tell us about your mom and your dad. Did you have siblings? What was the house like? Was science bred into you right out of the gate?
Yeah, so my dad is a mathematician. My mom, her whole career was a preschool teacher and then ran a preschool. I think what I do now is kind of in between, right? Yeah. When you work with kids, your job is to observe behavior. Your job is to think about things like learning and attention, and to think of creative ways to reach people, creative ways to teach. Yeah. And I think that both of those influences were really important for me as well. I have a younger brother who is brilliant and who really approaches the world with an engineer's mindset. And he was always the kid who took everything apart sometimes put it to get back together, sometimes not. But I think that those influences were all really important to me. I also grew up in California, and so we spent a lot of time outside and a lot of time in nature. And I think those are things that have always been important to me. And I think I learned very organically the value of thinking about big ideas, but while you're doing something else. Yeah.
I think I read someplace where you described yourself as shy, as a little reserved. Is that true?
Yeah, I think, I have a colleague now who was a TA of mine when I was an undergrad, and he said, you never talked then. And I have never been somebody whose threshold for sharing my opinions is super low. I've never been the loudest voice in the room. Yeah. I like to think about things very slowly. I've definitely never been the quickest person in the room. I think, obviously, as I've developed expertise, although in my little area of the world, I've gotten more confident in those ways. Yeah. Teaching has been a big deal for me, but I think that was something else. It was important for me to have role models who interacted with the world in all different ways.
Yeah. Well, I think I asked this because, I know from my own graduate students and my own children, there are folks that are shy, and I think it's nice for people to see somebody like you who is a self-professed, maybe a little introverted, but being completely able and capable, as you've gone on in your career of projecting your opinions and that, witness you sitting here totally comfortable, and that is there something to that, like how you learned that? You mentioned role models. I mean, how has that developed for you?
Slowly and with effort. I think communicating about science is incredibly important. That's part of why I'm grateful for what you do. It's something that honestly didn't come terribly naturally to me. Yeah. It's something I really tried to learn from many mentors. In particular, Bill Newsom is phenomenal at this, and was phenomenal at showing me that it's okay to keep asking questions till you actually understand something. You know, I always assumed if I didn't understand something, that was my fault, and maybe it was, but you know,
but it's okay
my
to ask
job
questions,
is to understand those things. So I put a lot of effort into learning how to communicate in writing and speaking. I think also I realized that I don't need to lead by telling people to do things or by making my opinion loud. I think really great science makes people feel that it's inevitable to come over to those interesting questions or approaches or ideas.
Well, I hope I didn't make you uncomfortable there. I think that's actually will be very useful to some of the folks watching in, you know, to understand that there's, you know, there's an end in sight and that you can get there. Marlene Cohen, it has been an absolute pleasure having you here. Thank you so much for taking time out to chat with our audience.
Thank you. Really nice to talk to you.
Lovely.